The Celestial Mariner surged through the heavy seas, its hull groaning against the relentless waves of the Pacific. Captain Jonathan Marlowe stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the horizon, while his crew busied themselves securing the deck and checking the rigging, their movements practiced and precise despite the choppy waters. "Mr. Fletcher, report," Captain Marlowe called out, his voice barely cutting through the howling wind. First Mate Fletcher, a sturdy man weathered by years at sea, approached the captain, clutching a rolled map against the gusts. "Sir, we're right on course for Valparaiso. Should make landfall in 2 days, barring any unforeseen circumstances." Marlowe nodded, taking the map and spreading it on the wheel stand, anchoring corners with his and Fletcher's hands. "And the weather report?" "This fog isn't natural. It's unlike any I've seen, Captain," Fletcher replied, squinting at the opaque mist that had enveloped the ship. "It came out of nowhere. The barometer's dropping fast, which could mean a storm, but the air's too still." The crew listened intently, sensing the tension between the familiar rhythms of their duties and the unsettling calm that had fallen. As the fog thickened, the sunlight dimmed, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the deck. "Keep a sharp lookout, gentlemen," Marlowe instructed, his eyes scanning the void. "This fog could hide anything." "Aye, Captain," came a chorus of affirmations. Just as the crew resumed their tasks, a sharp-eyed lookout perched in the crow's nest shouted, "Land ho! Strange shadows to starboard." Marlowe grabbed his spyglass and peered through the dense mist. The outline of an island slowly materialized, its features grotesquely distorted by the swirling fog. "That's no charted island," he muttered, a mix of curiosity and caution in his tone. Fletcher peered over the map again. "There's nothing marked here, sir. We could be the first to lay eyes on it. A discovery." Marlowe mused, the explorer's spark igniting within him. "Mr. Fletcher, prepare a landing party. We'll investigate." The crew murmured among themselves, unease rippling through their ranks. Sailors were a superstitious lot, and the unexplained was often deemed ominous. "Sir, is it wise?" Fletcher asked, his voice low. "We don't know what's out there. This could be dangerous." "Every land was unknown until someone dared to step on it," Marlowe replied, his gaze still fixed on the island. "We have an opportunity, Mr. Fletcher. I intend to take it." As the ship drew closer, the island seemed to rise ominously from the sea, cliffs jagged like the jaws of some leviathan. The crew readied the rowboats with a tense efficiency, their faces set and somber under the captain's determined command. "We'll take water, provisions, and arms," Marlowe instructed. "We don't know what we might find or what might find us." The sailors nodded, loading the boats under the eerie glow of lanterns, the light barely piercing the fog. The sea was strangely calm as they rowed towards the shore, the silence oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic splash of oars. As the boat scraped the gravelly beach, Marlowe was the first to disembark, his boots sinking slightly into the cold, wet sand. He turned, helping his men ashore. "This island isn't right, sir," one of the sailors, Jenkins, whispered, his voice shaky. "It feels like we're being watched." Marlowe clapped him on the shoulder. "Courage, Jenkins. We're not the type to be scared off by a bit of mystery. Let's secure the beach and set up a perimeter." With a nod, Jenkins moved to comply, his resolve bolstered by the captain's confidence. As they gathered on the beach, forming a small band of lantern lights against the encroaching darkness, Captain Marlowe addressed his crew. "Stay sharp, stay together. We don't know what we're dealing with, but we do know we won't face it alone." With those final words, they stepped forward into the shadowed embrace of the uncharted island, unaware of the true nature of the darkness that awaited them beyond the veil of fog and fear. As the crew of the Celestial Mariner trekked deeper into the island, the fog seemed to thicken with each step, swirling around them like a living entity. The ground beneath their boots was soft, the soil black and oddly spongy, as if it had not felt the weight of human footsteps in eons. Captain Marlowe led the way, lantern held high, casting eerie shadows on the twisted trees that bordered their path. The trees were gnarled, their branches reaching out like the fingers of a desperate spectre. "Captain, look at this," Fletcher called out, pointing at the ground. The soil was not just wet. It was marked with irregular, shallow indentations. Tracks, or I'm a landlubber. Marlowe crouched down, examining the marks. "Not like any animal I know of," he murmured. "Keep your eyes peeled, everyone. We're not alone here." The crew exchanged nervous glances, gripping their weapons tighter. The island's oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of their own movements. Even the sea seemed muted here, its roars distant and subdued. As they continued, the air grew colder, a chill that seeped into their bones. Marlowe stopped, noticing a peculiar formation ahead, a circle of stones, ancient and moss-covered, arranged with intentional symmetry. "This is man-made," he said, stepping into the circle to inspect a central stone that bore faint, weathered carvings. Symbols of some kind. Fletcher joined him, tracing the carvings with his finger. "Older than any sailor's tale. Could be we've stumbled upon something significant, Captain, or something best left undisturbed," muttered Jenkins from the edge of the circle, his eyes scanning the dense woods that surrounded them. Ignoring the warning in Jenkins' tone, Marlowe took a moment to sketch the symbols in his notebook. "This could be an important discovery. Let's document what we can, but stay alert." The crew set about their tasks, some taking measurements while others sketched the stones. The strange quiet of the island seemed to press in on them, a tangible force that urged caution. Suddenly, a low, throaty hum filled the air, resonant and growing louder, as if the island itself were groaning under their weight. The men froze, looking to one another in alarm. "What in God's name is that?" one of the sailors whispered. "Back to the beach," Marlowe commanded, his voice a calm force amidst rising panic. "Move out. Double time." They retreated the way they had come, the humming sound escalating into a wail that followed them, as persistent as the fog. As they neared the beach, the ground shook slightly underfoot, causing them to stumble. Reaching the relative safety of the shoreline, they turned back to see the fog rolling in thicker, obscuring the path and the eerie stone circle from view. "We need to leave now," Fletcher insisted, his face drawn and pale. "This place is cursed, Captain. It's alive, somehow." Marlowe looked back at the obscured island, his mind racing. "We can't leave yet. Not until we understand what this is." "But, Captain," Jenkins started to protest. Marlowe cut him off. "We won't be deterred by superstitions. However, we'll take precautions. We set up camp here on the beach, within sight of the Celestial Mariner. We stay together, keep the fire going, and maintain a watch throughout the night." As they set about building a fire and establishing a makeshift camp, the sun began to set, casting the island in hues of blood-red and shadow. The sea, previously a silent companion, now seemed to whisper with the same rhythmic cadence as the hum they'd heard in the woods. Sitting around the fire, the crew kept close, the flickering flames casting long shadows that danced across their tense faces. Marlowe, notebook in hand, reviewed the sketches they had made, his mind teeming with theories and dread. "Whatever secrets this island holds," he said to the group, his voice steady, "we will uncover them, but not at the cost of our lives. If the threat becomes too great, we will abandon this venture and return to the ship." The men nodded, the firelight reflecting in their wide, anxious eyes. Through the night, the sounds of the island, the distant hum, the whispering waves, mingled with the dreams of the weary sailors, pulling them into a restless slumber filled with visions of dark, shifting shapes and forgotten ancient whispers that promised revelations and threats intertwined like the gnarled branches of the island's haunting trees. Under the wan light of a crescent moon, The crew of the Celestial Mariner lay scattered around the dying fire, their sleep restless and disturbed by the island's eerie lullabies. Captain Marlowe, however, remained vigilant, his back to a cold rock, eyes fixed on the impenetrable darkness that surrounded their makeshift camp. Fletcher, sitting nearby, shuffled closer, wrapping his coat tighter against the chill. "I've never known a place so silent, Captain. It's as if the island is holding its breath." Marlowe nodded, his eyes scanning the tree-line. "It's unnatural. The sea, the wind, even the birds refuse to speak here. Keep your voice down, and your eyes open." As they spoke, a faint rustling emerged from the darkness, subtle yet distinct against the silence. Both men tensed, reaching for their weapons. The rustling grew louder, approaching from the woods. "Who goes there?" Marlowe called out sternly, his hand on the hilt of his sword. Out of the shadows a figure appeared, staggering towards the light. It was Jenkins, his face pale and his eyes wild with fear. "Captain, it's not right. There's something back there," he gasped, collapsing near the fire. Marlowe and Fletcher rushed to his side, lifting him gently. "Jenkins, what did you see?" Marlowe asked, concern etching his features. I thought I heard something by the shore. Went to check it. Then I saw them. Shadows, moving, whispering." Jenkins's voice shook as he clutched his captain's arm. "They weren't human, sir. Not by any measure." Marlowe exchanged a grave look with Fletcher. "Stay with the others. Keep everyone close and the fire lit. We need light to hold whatever this is at bay." Turning to Fletcher, he said, "Let's go. We need to see this for ourselves." With lanterns in hand, they moved cautiously towards the shore. The air grew inexplicably colder as they approached the water's edge. The fog seemed to pulse with a life of its own, ebbing and flowing around them like the breath of some slumbering beast. Suddenly, a dense black cloud surged from the trees, enveloping them in darkness so absolute that it swallowed the light from their lanterns. Marlowe and Fletcher stood frozen, their hearts racing as they felt the presence of something ancient and malevolent in the black mist. "Captain, do you hear that?" Fletcher whispered, his voice trembling. Listening intently, Marlowe could make out a faint chanting, a cacophony of whispers that seemed to echo from all directions. "It's the island," he murmured. "It's alive with memories or spirits. We need to understand this, not fear it." "How do we fight a shadow, Captain?" Fletcher asked, his usual composure cracked by the chilling encounter. "We document. We learn. We survive," Marlowe responded, pulling out his notebook and beginning to scribble hastily, describing the sensations, the sounds, and the shift in the air. As suddenly as it had appeared, the black cloud receded, retreating back into the forest, leaving them standing by the gentle lap of the wavelets on the shore. The moonlight returned, casting a silver glow that made the world seem momentarily serene. "Let's get back to the camp. We'll need to prepare if we're to stay till dawn," Marlowe said, his resolve hardening. They made their way back to the others, the weight of the night's events heavy on their shoulders. Back at the camp, the crew was stirring, unrest and anxious. Marlowe took charge, his voice calm yet commanding. "We stand watch in pairs until daybreak. Whatever this island holds, we face it together. Rest when you can, and stay within the light." As the night deepened, so did the chill, and a mist began to roll in from the sea, thicker and more oppressive than before. Marlowe, back at his post, wrote furiously, his notes a jumble of observations and orders. Fletcher joined him, his gaze lost in the fire. "Captain, do you think what Jenkins saw was real? Or is this place playing tricks on our minds?" "It's as real as the fear it stokes in our hearts, Mr. Fletcher," Marlowe replied, not lifting his eyes from his notebook. "But fear is a weapon only if we grant it power. We must remain rational, document everything, and not succumb to the shadows. As they spoke, a low hum began to fill the air, resonant and deep, growing steadily louder. The men looked around, realizing that the sound was not approaching. It was rising from the ground beneath them, vibrating through the earth as if the island itself were moaning. With a determined breath, Captain Marlowe closed his notebook and stood, facing the darkness. "Keep the fire alive, gentlemen. Dawn will soon be upon us, and with it answers." The crew rallied, feeding the fire and standing closer together, their eyes wide and watchful as they faced the unknown horrors of the shadowed isle. As the darkness deepened around the camp, the men of the Celestial Mariner found themselves trapped in a battle of nerves against the island's unnerving silence and mysterious phenomena. The fire crackled and popped, a small beacon of life in the oppressive blanket of night. Captain Marlowe paced near the fire, his eyes never ceasing their watchful survey of the shadowy Treeline. The men were gathered in tight groups, murmuring in low tones, their faces flickering in the firelight, each flicker casting monstrous shadows that danced along the periphery of the campsite. Fletcher approached the captain, his expression grave. "The men are on edge, sir. If we don't find something tangible to justify this mission soon, I fear we'll lose any semblance of order." Marlowe nodded, understanding the weight of his first mate's words. "Keep them busy. Fear is less overwhelming when hands and minds are occupied." "I'll see to it," Fletcher replied, before turning to distribute tasks, anything to keep the crew from stewing in their own dark thoughts. Suddenly, from the darkness beyond the circle of light, a chilling scream tore through the night. The men jumped to their feet, grabbing their weapons as two figures stumbled into the camp, breathless and terror-stricken. "It's Dawson and Greer," one of the sailors shouted as the camp rallied around the two. "What happened out there?" Marlowe demanded, his voice firm yet tinged with concern as he knelt beside them. Dawson, the younger of the two, was pale, his eyes wide with unspoken horrors. We heard something by the eastern ridge. Sounded like someone crying. We thought maybe it was a stranded sailor, thought maybe the island had other visitors." Greer, older and usually unflappable, was shaking, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't human, Captain. It was a lure. We saw it, the thing a shadow, but with eyes that glowed like coals. It spoke, Captain." "What did it say?" Marlowe pressed, his own curiosity a mask for his rising dread. "It knew us, sir," Greer continued, his body trembling. "It spoke our names, whispered things it shouldn't know, things from our past." A silence fell over the crew, each man suddenly aware of his own vulnerability. Marlowe stood, addressing his men with a calm he was far from feeling. "This island is more than it seems. It may be haunted or cursed or both, but we are not leaving until daylight. We will face this together." As he spoke, a low, mournful wind began to rise, the trees swaying as if in response to his declaration. The fire flickered wildly, shadows dancing more frenetically as if agitated by the captain's challenge. "Form a circle, backs to the fire," Marlowe ordered. "We'll take turns standing watch. No one goes into the dark alone." The men obeyed, forming a perimeter around the campfire, their faces set in grim determination. Marlowe took the first watch, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Hours passed, each minute stretching into eternity as the crew waited for another sign of the unknown horror that stalked them. Fletcher, joining Marlowe in the quiet vigil, spoke softly. "Do you think it will come back?" "It's testing us," Marlowe replied, his voice low. "Testing our fears, our resolve. We must not falter." The night crept on, the fire's light casting an eerie glow that seemed to shrink as the darkness grew bolder. Whispered conversations began to cease, and soon all that could be heard was the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, slow and deliberate. The crew tensed, weapons raised, but Marlowe held up a hand to stay their action. The figure stepped into the light. It was an old man, impossibly old, his skin like parchment, his eyes deep and knowing. "Who are you?" Marlowe demanded, stepping forward but cautious. "I am a guardian of sorts," the old man replied, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "This island is a place of testing, of revealing. You carry burdens, Captain, as do your men. Here, those burdens can be confronted. And what if we refuse?" Marlowe asked, his gaze never leaving the old man's. "Then the island will consume more than your fears," he responded solemnly. "Face what haunts you, or be forever lost to the shadows." With those cryptic words, the old man turned, disappearing back into the darkness from which he had come, leaving the crew to ponder his warning as they watched the night slowly yield to the grey light of dawn. As the first pale rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a ghostly light over the island, Captain Marlowe and his crew felt a small measure of relief. Yet the memory of the night's encounters and the old man's cryptic message lingered heavily in the air. "We need to understand what this testing means," Marlowe said to Fletcher as they watched the sun rise. "This island, it's like nothing we've ever encountered. It knows us, somehow." Fletcher nodded, his face drawn and tired. "And what if we fail this test, Captain? What then? We've seen what it can do. Play with our minds, bring out our deepest fears." "We have to keep our heads," Marlowe replied, his voice firm. "We'll explore the island by daylight. Maybe we'll find something to help us make sense of all this." The crew assembled, still shaken but bolstered by the daylight, and they set off towards the center of the island. The landscape changed as they moved away from the beach. The trees grew denser, and a thick undergrowth made their progress slow. As they trekked, Marlowe couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He paused, scanning the trees. "Keep close, and stay alert. We're not alone here." Suddenly, Jenkins, who had been quiet since the previous night, stopped and stared into the woods. "Captain, look." His voice was a whisper, strained with fear. Everyone halted and followed his gaze. There, between two large trees, stood a shadowy figure, its form blurry and indistinct, but unmistakably human-like. It didn't move, but its presence was as tangible as the damp air they breathed. Marlowe stepped forward, his hand on his sword. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" The figure remained silent, and then, as if dissolving into the air, it vanished, leaving behind a cold spot in the air that made them shiver. "This place plays tricks on us," muttered Greer, gripping his rifle tighter. "It's toying with us, Captain." Marlowe turned to his crew, his expression steely. "We may be pawns in its game, but we are not helpless. Let's move on." They continued their journey inward, the island seemingly endless. Hours passed, and with each step the sense of unease grew. They found more signs of the island's eerie influence. Trees that seemed to whisper when the wind blew, shadows that moved just beyond the corner of their eyes, and distant sounds of laughter that vanished when they turned to look. Eventually, they stumbled upon a clearing, at the center of which lay an ancient stone well. Its presence was out of place amidst the wild undergrowth, and it bore the same carved symbols they had seen on the stone circle. Could this be what the old man meant? Fletcher wondered aloud, peering into the dark depths of the well. "Maybe it's a source of whatever power the island holds," Marlowe speculated. He knelt by the well, peering into its shadowed interior. "We should take a closer look." Just as he spoke, a wind rose up from the well, carrying a whispering voice. "Look deeper," it urged, echoing around them. Marlowe, driven by a need to understand, leaned further, his lantern casting light into the abyss. The walls of the well were lined with the same symbols, glowing faintly as if alive. "This is it," Marlowe said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. "This well, it's important. It's part of the test." As they discussed their findings, a sudden gust of wind blew out their lanterns, plunging them into darkness. Panic ensued as the crew scrambled in the dark, shouting to each other in confusion. "Stay calm. Regroup at the well." Marlowe's command cut through the chaos. Slowly, they found each other in the darkness. But as they regrouped, a heart-stopping realization dawned on them. Jenkins was missing. "He was right next to me," Dawson exclaimed, his voice shaky. "He can't have gone far," Fletcher said, trying to sound confident. "We'll find him." Using the faint light from the well, they searched the nearby area, calling for Jenkins. But there was no reply, only the mocking rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant, ominous sound of the ocean. As they returned to the clearing, Marlowe faced his crew, his face a mask of determination and fatigue. "We can't leave him." We split into 2 teams. One will stay here at the well, and the other will search. We'll find Jenkins and get off this cursed island. The crew, though weary and frightened, nodded in agreement. There was no leaving one of their own behind. Not here, not in this nightmarish place. With that, they set out once more into the embrace of the shadowed woods, driven by duty and the faint hope of escape. As the search teams fanned out from the clearing, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows through the dense canopy of the forest. Captain Marlowe led one group, while Fletcher commanded the other, their paths diverging in a desperate bid to find Jenkins before darkness could reclaim the island. "Keep within earshot," Marlowe instructed his group, his voice low and urgent. "And for God's sake, keep your wits about you." The forest seemed to close in around them as they moved, the underbrush snagging at their clothes, the trees whispering secrets in a language only the wind understood. Every shadow seemed to watch them, every rustle a potential threat. Suddenly, from somewhere off to their left, came a scream, piercing, laden with terror. Marlowe's head snapped in the direction of the sound. That was Dawson. "This way." He broke into a run, his men trailing behind him, crashing through the undergrowth toward the source of the scream. They found Dawson moments later, his back pressed against a tree, his eyes wide and staring at something only he could see. It was here," he stammered, pointing shakily into the brush. "Jenkins. It took him. Right in front of me." Marlowe grabbed Dawson by the shoulders, giving him a slight shake. "Focus, man. What took him? What did you see?" "I don't know," Dawson gasped, his breathing ragged. "It was like a shadow, but it was alive. It moved like smoke, like mist. It surrounded him, and then he was gone." A heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by the distant sound of the sea and the mournful call of an unseen bird. Marlowe released Dawson, turning to address his team. "We need to regroup with Fletcher. This island, it's hunting us." They made their way back to the clearing by the well, their movements hurried and fearful. The sky was a deepening shade of twilight by the time they arrived, finding Fletcher and his group waiting, their expressions grim. "No sign of him," Fletcher reported, his voice heavy with defeat. "And you?" Marlowe shook his head. "We need to get off this island. Now." "But Jenkins," one of the sailors began. "Is likely beyond our help," Marlowe cut in, his tone final. "This island is a predator. We stay, and we'll all vanish one by one. Prepare to move out. We're heading back to the beach, to the boats." As they gathered their gear, a dense fog began to roll in from the sea, enveloping the island in a thick, suffocating blanket. The path back to the beach became obscured, the visibility dropping to just a few feet in front of them. "Stay close. Hold on to the person in front of you," Marlowe ordered, leading the way with a lantern that did little more than glow dimly through the fog. The journey back was harrowing, the fog disorienting them, twisting their sense of direction. More than once, they had to stop, reorient themselves, and start again. Whispers seemed to float through the air, carried by the fog, taunting them, calling their names. "It's trying to separate us," Marlowe muttered, his gaze fixed on the barely visible path. "Ignore it. Keep moving." Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged from the fog onto the beach, the sight of the surf breaking on the sand a welcome one. But as they approached the spot where they had left the boats, a cold realization set in. The boats were gone. "No! No, no, no!" Fletcher exclaimed, running to the water's edge, searching the surf as if the boats might magically appear. They were right here. Secured. Marlowe surveyed the beach, his mind racing. The tide hadn't come in far enough to sweep them away. It was as if the island itself had swallowed them. "We build a raft," he said finally, his voice calm despite the desperation of their situation. "We gather what we can from the beach, anything that floats. We're not spending another night on this island." The men set to work, driven by a frenetic energy, their fear fueling their efforts. They gathered driftwood, torn nets, anything that might aid their escape. As night fell, they worked by the light of a single fire, the crackling flames a stark contrast to the soft lapping of the waves. Marlowe stood apart, watching the horizon. The island had taken much from them, but he would not let it take everything. "We will survive this," he vowed softly to the sea. "We must." As they labored into the night, building a makeshift raft that represented their only hope, the island watched, silent and inscrutable, its secrets as deep and dark as the waters that surrounded it. By the time the raft was ready, the sky had turned a deep black, punctuated only by faint stars that seemed distant and indifferent to the crew's plight. The fire they'd kept alive was now a fragile glow, flickering uncertainly against the weight of the surrounding darkness. The beach felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. The island had become a malevolent presence, watching, waiting. "We need to move quickly before the tide changes," Captain Marlowe said, surveying the makeshift raft his men had cobbled together. It was crude, a patchwork of driftwood, scraps of their missing boats, and anything that would float, but it was their only hope of escape. "Ready, Captain," Fletcher responded, his voice taut with exhaustion. The men, too, were weary, haunted by the loss of Jenkins and the horrors that seemed to live in the very air they breathed. But now, with the raft assembled and the dark waters before them, they all felt the pressing urgency to leave. "Everyone aboard," Marlowe commanded, casting one final glance toward the darkened forest. "We'll need to paddle like our lives depend on it." The men scrambled onto the raft, their movements hurried and nervous. The raft rocked under their combined weight, creaking ominously, but held steady as it was pushed out into the shallow surf. The oars, salvaged from the wreckage of their boats, splashed against the water in a steady rhythm. For the first time since landing on the cursed island, a flicker of hope kindled in their hearts as they moved away from the shore. The island receded slowly into the fog behind them, its twisted trees and sinister shadows becoming less defined with each stroke. For a brief moment, the world felt larger again, and the oppressive grip of the island loosened. "We're doing it," Greer muttered from the back of the raft, his voice shaky with disbelief. "We're actually getting away." Marlowe remained silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew better than to trust in hope too soon. Something about the island's silence unsettled him. There had been no final attempt to stop them, no more shadowy figures, no whispered voices. The calmness felt unnatural. Just as the raft drifted into deeper waters, a strange mist began to rise from the ocean, swirling around them in tendrils. The men tensed, glancing at each other with wide eyes. "Damn it," Fletcher muttered. "Not again." The mist thickened unnaturally fast, curling around the raft like a shroud, its presence suffocating. The rhythmic splashing of the oars began to echo unervingly, as if the mist itself was swallowing the sound. Soon they were completely enveloped, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. The island was now out of sight, but the fog made it feel as though they hadn't moved at all. "Keep paddling," Marlowe shouted over the growing hum that emanated from the mist. "Don't stop. We'll break through it." But the mist clung to them, unrelenting. It thickened, swirling faster, and the air grew heavy with the same strange energy they had felt on the island, the oppressive sense of being watched, of being surrounded by something ancient and unspeakable. Suddenly, from the depths of the mist, a voice echoed, a voice they recognized. Captain Marlowe. The men froze. Marlowe's grip tightened on his oar, his heart pounding. The voice wasn't coming from the island. It was coming from the mist, from the ocean itself. "It's Jenkins," whispered Greer, his face pale. "He's alive." "Don't listen," Marlowe barked, his eyes scanning the swirling fog. "That's not Jenkins. It's the island trying to draw us back." "Captain," the voice whispered again, clearer this time and more insistent. "You left me behind. You can't leave me." Greer hesitated, his hand trembling on his oar. "Maybe he's out there, Captain. We can't leave him." "Greer, no." Marlowe's command cut through the growing panic. "It's a trick. Keep rowing, or we'll all end up like him." But Greer wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were wide, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I can hear him, Captain. He's close. Jenkins is out there." Before anyone could stop him, Greer leaped from the raft, disappearing into the mist. His splash echoed for a moment before being swallowed by the silence. "Greer!" Dawson shouted, moving toward the edge of the raft, but Marlowe grabbed him, yanking him back. "Stay on the raft." Marlowe growled, his voice fierce. "We've lost enough men. Do not let this place take you." They sat in stunned silence for a moment, listening as Greer's frantic splashing grew distant. The mist around them swirled faster, and the strange hum from the island returned, low and menacing. "Captain," Fletcher whispered, his voice taut with fear. "What are we going to do?" Marlowe's mind raced, but he was at a loss. The island had unleashed something upon them, something far more dangerous than shadows or whispers. It was in the air, in the water, surrounding them, drowning them in its madness. And then, just as suddenly as the mist had closed in, the hum stopped. The swirling fog stilled, hanging thick and unmoving around them, and from within that silence came a sound that froze their blood. Greer's voice, echoing from the mist. "Captain, I found Jenkins." The crew remained silent, gripping their oars tightly, the horror of their situation settling in like a sickness in their bones. "I found him," Greer's voice repeated, closer now, almost intimate. "He's waiting for you." Marlowe stood, glaring into the fog, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "What are you?" For a moment there was no reply. Then the mist shifted, as if drawing closer, and the voice responded in a low, rasping tone that sent chills down every man's spine. "I am the island. I am what lies beneath. You cannot leave. You are all mine." A collective shudder passed through the crew. Fletcher, his face ashen, turned to Marlowe. "We're not getting off this island, are we, Captain?" Marlowe's silence was answer enough. He stared into the mist, his fists clenched, and whispered, "We'll see about that." Determined not to give in, Marlowe barked, "Row." "Now!" The men snapped out of their frozen fear and rowed with all their remaining strength, trying to escape the mist's grasp. But the harder they rowed, the more the mist thickened, pulling them in, suffocating them with its ancient, malevolent power. As the raft creaked and groaned under the strain, Marlowe felt a chill creep up his spine. The ocean, once their ally, now seemed to conspire with the island, drawing them back toward the cursed shore. The fog swirled faster, and the voice grew louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "You belong to me." The raft suddenly lurched, as if caught in a strong current. The men gripped their oars tighter, panic flashing in their eyes. "Captain!" Fletcher called out, pointing ahead. The mist parted just enough for them to see. A massive, jagged rock looming in their path, the currents pulling them toward it with deadly force. Marlowe cursed, trying to steer the raft away, but it was too late. The raft smashed into the rock with a sickening crack, splintering apart and tossing the men into the icy water. Marlowe struggled to stay afloat, gasping for air as the freezing waves crashed over him. He could hear the shouts of his men, but the mist swallowed their voices, pulling them into the abyss. For a moment, everything went silent. Marlowe, his strength waning, drifted in the water, his body numb from the cold. The last thing he saw before the mist claimed him was the island, looming in the distance, its shadowy cliffs watching him like a predator eyeing its prey. And then, darkness. The Celestial Mariner was found days later, adrift in the calm waters of the Pacific. Not a single soul remained aboard, and no trace of the crew was ever found. Only Captain Marlowe's logbook remained, its final entry scrawled in a shaky hand. "We thought we could leave, but the island won't let us. It knows us. It owns us." The island, now marked as a place of doom on maritime charts, became a whispered legend among sailors, a place where shadows moved of their own accord, and where the ocean itself would turn against those who dared to land. No one ever returned from the island, and no one ever would.